A rose blooming from stone, an impossible clue, yet Holmes finds meaning. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Share where you're tuning in from below. Your voices make this mystery come alive. Now, the story begins. On an evening when London's winter fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street like a persistent beggar, Dr. Watson returned to find Mr. Sherlock Holmes imparting a critique upon the kettle. It had, in Holmes's opinion, whistled in B-flat when it ought to have attempted, at the very least, an A. This pronouncement, delivered while he sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, with a violin at his side and the remains of a Persian cigarette in the ash, was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger boy in a coal-smudged scarf bearing a letter sealed with a flecked red wax. Holmes glanced at the hand before the envelope had fully left the boy's fingers. He murmured that our correspondent chewed the left corner of his penholder, used an inferior sealing wax, and worked in a place where grit floated in the air. When I inquired, perhaps too tartly, how wax and grit could reveal so much, he merely smiled that long, thin smile of his, and asked the boy to await an answer. The letter within was brief and signed with a name known even to the inattentive reader of the Society columns. Sir Alistair Darnington, a baronet lately returned from an extended absence upon the continent. His message, written in a steady, impatient hand, requested our immediate attendance at Darnington House in Bloomsbury upon a matter he termed inexplicable and likely disgraceful if not properly managed. Holmes grew more alert as he read, and when he laid the page upon his knee, I observed the faintest narrowing of his eyes, his version of a shout. "There. Watson," he said, tapping the seal flakes scattered on the table. "Red wax adulterated with iron fines. One associates that impurity not with polite writing desks, but with a bench near grinding or stone-cutting apparatus. Now, why should the secretary of a fashionable baronet keep his correspondence at a table dusted with filings? Either he writes in the wrong room, or the house itself is engaged in some curious alteration. Forgive me," I said, "but Darnington House is a venerable Georgian building. I cannot see Sir Alistair consenting to a mason's yard within it." Holmes's smile widened. "Then the grit does not come from the house. It travels with the man." He wrote a swift acceptance and dispatched the boy. Before we set forth, he crossed to the mantel and took up a small bouquet that had been left that morning by Mrs. Hudson with the tea. Humble daisies rescued from a push-cart. Holmes turned them with unexpected gentleness, and I noticed a smudge upon one petal, a ghost of brick-red powder. He brushed it away with his thumb. "You see, Watson, how readily London's dust insinuates itself into innocent company. Remember that tonight." A closed brougham carried us to Bloomsbury through lanes thick with fog and the damp reek of the river. The lamps made islands of amber in a gray sea, and the horses' hooves struck sparks on wet stone. Darnington House presented a sober, respectable facade. Iron railings glossed with mist, a fanlight glimmering faintly over the door, the stone steps scrubbed within an inch of their lives. A butler of the old breed, grave, immaculate, and deeply affronted by existence, admitted us and guided us through a passage that smelled pleasantly of beeswax and older books. Sir Alistair awaited us in a library whose shelves might have satisfied a bishop. He rose with the nervous quickness of a man unaccustomed to uncertainty. His features were narrow and patrician, though a bar of fatigue lay upon the forehead. I noticed at once that his right cuff bore a faint crescent mark the color of dried clay, hastily brushed. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am indebted to you for your speed. The matter touches my family honor." So the letter indicated. Holmes returned, and his gaze skimmed the room in that way of his, never lingering, always seeing. "Pray sit, Sir Alistair, and make the particulars known." The baronet hesitated, his fingers restlessly aligning an already straight paper knife. "You will think me fanciful, perhaps even deluded. Delusion leaves footprints," Holmes said. "We shall follow them or dismiss them according to what they reveal. Proceed." Sir Alistair drew a breath. 2 weeks ago, I reopened Darnington House after 5 years spent abroad. During that interval, my cousin Reginald, my heir until I should marry, occupied certain rooms and oversaw works upon the south garden. He was fond of antiquities and fancied, absurdly, that an older terrace might be found beneath the gravel. He engaged a firm of masons, Clay and Telfer, to cut and relay the paving. Their men were noisy, untidy, and sometimes insolent. I had word of it in Florence, but could do nothing. When I returned, I found Reginald gone to his club in the country and the south garden altered. The paving had been relaid, the beds re-edged, and at the center, this is where your disbelief will begin, there stands a thing no botanist can explain. A rose bush grows out of solid stone. Holmes's eyebrows arched, but he said nothing. Sir Alister pressed on. It is no poet's flourish. The masons cut a new circular plinth of Portland stone to serve as a basin for a fountain that never arrived. From the very heart of that disk a rose cane has thrust itself, green, living, and thorned without crack or fissure in the stone. 3 nights ago it had no bud. Yesterday morning there was one. Today it opened. A pale blossom, almost white, and, well, it carries a faint dust upon its petals. Brick red, like iron filings. I could not help an involuntary sound. Holmes's glance flicked toward me, half amused. "You have had the stone examined?" he asked. "By Mr. Daw, a builder of reputation. He declares the disk intact. No seam, no concealed earth. He suggests a prank with a drilled passage and some ingenious molding. But he cannot find the trick and has become, if anything, testy over his failure. And the gardeners? Perplexed, embarrassed. The chief man, Montague, is proud of his skill and will not hear of a conjurer's trick upon his watch. He swears the stone arrived from the yard unblemished and was set by Clay and Telfer's men without mishap. I dismissed the firm yesterday after an altercation with their foreman." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Dismissed? That may be relevant. They were insolent. The foreman, one Mr. Telfer, implied that the rose might have been meant for me to find, which I took as impertinence of a vulgar order. I sent them off the premises and paid their account at once. Your cousin Reginald is absent," Holmes said softly. "Does he know of this marvel?" I wrote to him at the Briarwood Club, Sussex. No answer. Reginald is fond of theatricals. He likes to arrange surprises. But he would not risk public ridicule. Holmes rose and examined a small lacquer tray upon the library table. Upon it lay a pale smear like the one I had seen on the baronet's cuff. Holmes touched a fingertip to the residue, then smelt it. "You have touched the flower today," Sir Alister flushed. I confess it fascinated me. The dust clings to the petals. It stains the fingers faintly. "It would," Holmes murmured, "if the dust were magnetic." He flicked his finger against the paper knife and the powder scarcely moved. "No, not magnetic. Merely fine. One thinks of a saw or a wheel, of cutting where water runs over stone." He returned to the hearth and cast a glance into the fire, as though the coals might recite their own arrangement. "We shall see your miracle, Sir Alister. But before we do, tell me of your household. Who resides, who serves, and who resents it? My sister, Lady Eleanor, keeps house for me. She is in delicate health and rarely ventures out. Her companion, Miss Lydia Vale, is brisk and competent. She manages the household accounts. There is the butler, Rook, the housemaid Alice, a cook, Mrs. Pettifer, 2 footmen, and the gardeners, hired when needed, with Montague in charge. The only recent addition was a secretary during my absence, a Mr. Fabian Cole, to arrange correspondence. I have since thanked him and concluded his engagement." "Concluded? Why?" Sir Alister shifted. He was too apt to familiarity. A man who thinks his pen makes him indispensable soon believes his person is desired, too. Holmes's eyelids drooped. "Your secretary worked near Stone Dust." "Near Stone Dust?" Sir Alister looked surprised. The South Garden works meant grit everywhere. One could hardly avoid it. Holmes permitted himself a small, private nod. "Very good." We were conducted to the South Garden by the butler's solemn lantern. Fog lay over the beds like gauze. The trees were ebony silhouettes traced upon a deeper black. In the paved circle at the center stood the disk of Portland stone, pale as bone, and from its middle sprang the most singular rose I had ever seen. It was not large, but it had the crisp, confident look of a plant long at home. A single flower opened at the summit, milk-white with the faintest blush at its heart, and upon the outer petals lay, indeed, a rime of red dust, so fine that it seemed to float rather than rest. I touched my glove to it. The powder left a ghostly print. Holmes circled slowly, his lantern held low to throw lateral light across the stone. He knelt and set the flame near the base of the cane, studying the junction. The surface about the stem was unbroken. He tapped the disc in an outward ring with his knuckles, first soft, then harder, listening. The sound returned uniformly dull, as stone should. He sniffed, and I heard the briefest chuckle. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the evaporative pattern around the stem. The stone there is faintly darker, as though damp had exhaled and dried. Yet there has been no rain today." He lifted the lantern toward the rose. "And see the petal margin, a residue like that upon Sir Alister's cuff and the tray." "From the works," I suggested, though feebly. "Perhaps. Yet why does it persist upon a flower that opened this morning? Dust that clings so faithfully has a source still active." Sir Alister, who had watched our movements with a mixture of hope and pride, could no longer restrain himself. "Well, Mr. Holmes, am I mad, or the victim of a charlatan? Or is nature herself amused at our expense?" Holmes straightened. "Nature is seldom amused, Sir Alister. But men are, and some are paid to be." He turned then, lantern sweeping the ground. The beam caught a scuff upon the inner edge of the circle as though a heavy boot had pivoted there. A few inches farther, something minute glittered, a triangle no larger than a pinhead. Holmes captured it with the blade of his penknife and placed it upon his palm. Even in that meager light I could see it was a flake of glass, stained at one edge with a reddish smear. Holmes looked pleased. "A fragment from a gauge, or a sight, or perhaps a lamp chimney. We shall see. Sir Alister, who had access to this garden last night?" "No one, to my knowledge. The gate is locked. Rook keeps the key." "Then we must ask Rook to produce it, and also to recall whether he has recently oiled the hinge. This fog retains odors admirably." He raised his head, nostrils delicate. "Yes, there is also a smell here incongruous with roses or damp stone." "What smell?" I asked. He smiled sideways. "A whisper of paraffin, my dear fellow, and something like the shadow of vinegar. The combination suggests an apparatus of heat and vapor. Curious companions for a miracle of botany." Sir Alister's lantern shook slightly. "You mean to say—" "I mean to say nothing yet." Holmes's voice was unexpectedly kind. "You have done right to call me. This is not a prank executed by idle boys. It is methodical. It may be meant to frighten or to distract or to commemorate something we have not yet named." He looked again at the flower with an expression I had seen only when a problem truly pleased him. "A rose from stone. A poet's conceit made mechanical." He lowered the lantern and we began to retrace our steps toward the house. At the threshold, Holmes paused. He stooped, and with a folded card lifted a faint crescent of dried red dust from the flag. He held it up and let the light pass through the thin film. "Note it, Watson. Not brick at all, but the finer meal of iron, with a tang I should like you to taste presently in the lamp room. There is a workshop somewhere near this gentleman's honor." "And Reginald?" I ventured. Holmes's eyes flickered. "Ah, Reginald. A taste for theatricals, a silence at an awkward hour, and a club in Sussex called the Briarwood. Roses and briars share a family, do they not? File that with the rest." He turned to Sir Alister. "Tomorrow, if you please, I shall wish to speak to your sister, to Miss Vale, to your gardener, And to any workman of Clay and Telfer who has not already vanished in offense, tonight have Rook bring the gate key and the oil he used upon it, and instruct the house that no one, under any pretext, is to touch the rose. Sir Alistair bowed his head. You believe it can be explained? Everything may be, Holmes said, given patience and a lamp. He glanced once more into the fog where the pale circle lay like a moon fallen to earth. And this, I think, will require both. Thus the matter began, with a flower that ought not to exist, a dust that clung where it should have slipped away, and the first faint outline of a plan that would, in due time, reveal a deception as delicate and as thorned as any rose. The fog had thickened to a muffling curtain by the time we returned indoors, and Sir Alistair, with something of the host's shame at failing to provide clearer air, pressed upon us a glass of claret before retiring for the night. Holmes accepted, though I could see his mind was still circling the stone disk and the impossible rose. When at last we found ourselves alone in the guest chamber set aside for us, he seated himself at the writing desk, unrolled a scrap of paper, and began sketching. The lines were quick and spare, a circle, a stem, arrows that seemed to measure force and heat. He wrote figures in the margins, then tore the page and burned it in the candle flame. "It is too soon for hypotheses, Watson," he murmured as though reproving himself. "Yet I cannot help but admire the ingenuity. To persuade stone to flower, that is a conceit worthy of a poet, but the means will prove sordid enough." I ventured to ask what he thought of the red dust. He merely shook his head. "It is residue, nothing more, and residue tells us the tool, not the hand. What we require is the motive. One does not set out to puzzle baronets and gardeners without reason. Sleep was slow in coming. The image of the pale rose, luminous against the fog, returned again and again to my mind, until I began to doubt whether I had truly seen it. But at last the night passed, and with it the fog retreated, leaving the morning crisp, clear, and edged with frost. Holmes was already dressed when I woke, his gaze upon the window. He had a look I had come to know. Not rest, but a sharpening, as though the night had honed rather than dulled him. At breakfast, Sir Alistair joined us, looking strained yet eager. He had taken our instructions to heart. His sister, Lady Eleanor, and her companion, Miss Lydia Vale, were waiting in the drawing-room. The gardener Montague had been sent for, and Rook stood like a sentinel by the door, the great key of the south gate heavy on its ring. Holmes questioned the butler first, briefly and without flourish. Rook had oiled the hinges the previous morning, using a common paraffin preparation. He swore no one had the key but himself, though he admitted that workmen had passed freely while the masons were employed. Holmes asked to smell the oil, and after a moment's consideration declared it the same odor he had noticed in the fog. "You may keep it, Rook," he said. "It will serve you in good conscience. Tell me, how long has Mr. Cole, the secretary, been gone from this house?" "3 days, sir. He left with a single valise and said nothing of his direction." Holmes's gaze flickered, but he made no comment and dismissed the man. Next came Lady Eleanor, a woman of delicate bearing, her eyes bright with that peculiar light of those whose health has long been uncertain. She greeted us with a courtesy that concealed her nervousness. Holmes was gentle with her, speaking more softly than his habit. "Your brother has told us you rarely leave the house, Lady Eleanor. Yet you must have seen the rose." Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I saw it yesterday, Mr. Holmes. I thought, no, I feared it a sign. My family has been touched more than once by superstition. My cousin Reginald would laugh, but when I looked upon that flower rising from stone, I thought of my mother and of omens she once described. I would rather it were a trick than a prophecy." "Very natural," Holmes replied. "And your companion, Miss Vale, has she shared your view? She shared—" Lady Eleanor's eyes shifted to the younger woman seated beside her. Miss Vale was brisk, composed, and rather plain of face, though her voice carried a firmness that bespoke intelligence. "I," she said, "believe only in accounts and balances. This rose, sir, is an extravagance. Someone wished to unsettle Sir Alister, perhaps to drive him to rash expense or unwise trust. I advised him to consult you." Holmes studied her a moment, then inclined his head. "A wise suggestion. Tell me, did you handle the flower?" "Certainly not. I found it grotesque." There was a faint twist to her mouth, half disdain, half distaste. Holmes dismissed them courteously. When they had gone, he turned to Sir Alister. Two voices, two perspectives, one mystical, one practical. Neither explains the dust nor the missing cousin. Let us hear Montague. The gardener arrived, a broad-shouldered man with soil ingrained in his hands and a pride that showed even in the way he carried his cap. He was blunt. The stone had been set sound. The masons had done their work roughly but honestly, and he would stake his reputation that no trick could be played under his nose. Yet it was played, Holmes said. What men composed the gang? Montague listed them. Telfer, the foreman, two laborers named Briggs and Nolan, and a younger apprentice, Carter. Holmes's attention sharpened at the last name. This Carter, describe him. Quick lad. Too quick, perhaps. Clever hands, always fiddling with tools. I never caught him at mischief, but he had an eye that wandered. He left with the others when Sir Alister dismissed them. Holmes noted it silently. Then, quite suddenly, he asked Montague what he knew of Mr. Fabian Cole. The gardener shrugged. Slick fellow. Spoke too fine for a penman. Came to the garden once or twice, looked about, asked questions of the works. Said it was on Sir Alister's instructions. I thought him curious. When Montague was gone, Holmes remained seated for a long while, his gaze upon the carpet. At last he rose. "Watson, the shape sharpens. We have a rose that springs from stone, dust that clings too freshly, and men dismissed in haste. One cousin absent, one secretary fled, and an apprentice with clever hands. The puzzle lies not in how a rose grows from stone, but in who wishes us to believe it does. And that, I think, will soon prove more perilous than poetic." Holmes wasted no time in dwelling upon the gardener's testimony. The instant Montague had departed, he strode to the window, his long fingers drumming upon the sill as though marking the cadence of some silent composition. His eyes, half closed, traveled from the orderly garden paths toward the circle of stone where the pale rose stood faintly visible through the thinning mist. He remained thus for several minutes, then abruptly turned. "Watson, Sir Alister, we must examine the accounts. Miss Vale keeps them, does she not? A careful woman who believes only in balances may reveal more than she intends." Sir Alister hesitated, clearly reluctant to impose further upon his companion's sense of duty. But Holmes pressed with a firmness that brooked no denial. Presently, Miss Vale reappeared with a slim ledger bound in dark leather. She placed it upon the table and opened it with the neat precision of one long accustomed to orderly columns. Holmes bent over the pages, his gaze running lightly yet thoroughly across the figures. "Observe, Watson," he said, tapping a line of neat script. "An entry for Clay and Telfer's works, stone, tools, labor. But here, just above, an expenditure to a firm in Whitechapel, Purkis & Sons, suppliers of glass and chemical apparatus. This, Miss Vale, is not the purchase of a household." She colored faintly, but her voice remained calm. "Mr. Cole instructed me to discharge that account. He said it was for lamps required in the garden while the works were undertaken." "Lamps?" Holmes echoed, his voice tinged with irony. "A mason's gang requires lanterns, but not retorts, burners, and glass tubing. Did you never question this?" "I did," she replied, her tone firm, "but Mr. Cole assured me the matter was overseen by Sir Alister's cousin. I was not in a position to countermand his word." Holmes closed the book with a snap. "Precisely. And so we arrive again at Mr. Cole, and through him, perhaps, to Reginald Darnington." Sir Alister shifted uneasily in his chair. "You suggest my cousin conspired in this fabrication?" Holmes spread his hands. "I suggest nothing yet, but the presence of chemical glassware near a rose that blossoms from stone has a logic I cannot ignore. We must visit Purkis & Sons." Within the hour we were jolting eastward in a hansom, the baronet pale with suppressed agitation, Holmes silent and intent. The streets narrowed as we approached Whitechapel, their shop-fronts dingy, their air sharp with the odors of industry. Purkis and Sons proved to be a cramped establishment, its windows crowded with vessels of curious form, retorts, flasks, beakers, tubes. A thin man with a stoop emerged from behind the counter, his eyes quick with calculation. Holmes engaged him at once. "We come concerning a recent order, delivered to Darnington House in Bloomsbury. Retorts, tubing, burners. Kindly show us your record." The man pursed his lips. "We supply many gentlemen. I should need proof." Holmes produced his card, the sight of which often acted as a passport to reluctant tongues. Purkis examined it, then reluctantly fetched a ledger. Holmes turned the pages with the same swift scrutiny he had shown Miss Vale's accounts. At last, he stopped. "There. A purchase charged to Mr. Fabian Cole, secretary to Sir Alister Darnington. Delivered a fortnight past. The signature, Carter." "Carter?" I murmured. "The apprentice," Holmes confirmed, and there was a glint of satisfaction in his eye. "He signs for chemicals he cannot use, on behalf of a secretary who has since fled. This is the hand that placed the apparatus in the garden." Purkis added, with the faintest shrug, that the order included a small spirit lamp, lengths of narrow glass tubing, and a supply of sulfuric acid. At that word, Holmes's eyes brightened. "Skeptical though you are, Watson, you will recall how stone may be altered by acid, how heat may drive vapor through a concealed fissure, how a living plant might be made to seem to pierce marble. Our conjurers have been busy indeed. We left the shop and returned to the hansom. Sir Alister, though relieved to hear the matter assumed a mechanical rather than supernatural nature, grew only more troubled. But why, Mr. Holmes? Why should anyone contrive such a deception against me?" "Because, Sir Alister," Holmes replied gravely, "fear unsettles reason, and unsettled reason signs papers and yields advantage. I suspect we are not dealing merely with a jest." Back at Darnington House the afternoon had drawn in, and the air pressed with that damp chill peculiar to London's winter. Holmes insisted on another inspection of the garden before night fell. The rose stood as before, delicate and absurd in its triumph over stone. Holmes crouched beside it, his lens glittering as he traced the join between stem and disc. Suddenly he beckoned. "Watson, look here. The faintest line, scarcely visible. A seam where two halves meet, cunningly fused. And there, see the dark stain, as though some liquid had seeped and dried. This is no miracle. It is a contrivance." He straightened, his expression alight. "Our next task is to find where the apparatus was concealed. And that, I think, will not be in the stone itself, but beneath." We called for Montague, who fetched 2 of his men. Under Holmes's direction they levered up one edge of the disc with crowbars. Slowly, groaning against its own weight, the stone lifted, revealing a shallow cavity lined with damp soil. Within lay the remnants of a crude contraption, fragments of glass tubing, a spirit lamp cracked and empty, and a coil of wire blackened with use. The air reeked of sulfur. Sir Alister recoiled. "Then it is true, an artifice." Holmes regarded the debris with satisfaction. "Precisely. The stem was fed through from beneath, the rose kept alive in hidden soil until heat and vapor forced it upward, fusing the join so neatly that only close examination would reveal it. The dust upon the petals is the meal of iron from the cutting wheel that fashioned this hollow. He lifted one shard of tubing, its edge still tinged with red. "And here is our residue." Sir Alister pressed a hand to his brow. "But who placed it there? And for what end?" Holmes's gaze turned thoughtful. "That, Sir Alister, is the deeper question. The hand may have been Carter's, the mind Cole's. The purpose, your cousin's. We must learn which of the 3 commanded the others." He dropped the shard back into the cavity. "Tonight, Watson, we set a watch. For a ruse once exposed often tempts its architect to return. And if I mistake not, the garden of Darnington House will see visitors before dawn." Holmes's declaration that the garden would receive visitors before dawn left Sir Alister visibly shaken, though he attempted to conceal it beneath a show of aristocratic composure. He insisted upon posting his own footman to watch, but Holmes declined the offer with a curt shake of the head. "Your men will gossip, and gossip, Sir Alister, is precisely the currency in which our adversary trades. Better that Watson and I take the matter in hand. Two shadows in the fog are less conspicuous than half a dozen servants blundering with lanterns." Thus it was that, after the household retired, Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the south garden. The air was keen and carried a tang of coal smoke from some distant chimney. Holmes wore a dark cloak and had contrived to blend so entirely into the shrubs at the garden's edge that, had I not been crouched beside him, I might have lost him altogether. We had extinguished our lanterns, trusting to the wan light of a cloud-veiled moon that cast the stone circle into a pallid halo. For 2 hours nothing stirred, save the occasional flutter of a bird unsettled by the cold, or the far-off rattle of a cab along Bloomsbury's streets. My own thoughts grew sluggish with the monotony, but Holmes remained as taut as a drawn bowstring. His gaze never wavered from the gate. Then, shortly after midnight, the faintest creak reached us. Holmes touched my arm, and I followed his eyes. The gate had opened, just enough to admit a slim figure. The intruder moved with care, pausing often to listen, before gliding toward the stone disk. Even in the uncertain light I discerned youth in his gait. Holmes's lips brushed my ear in a whisper. "Carter." The lad, crouched by the disk, produced a small parcel from his coat and began unwrapping it with deft fingers. Holmes waited, coiled until the boy had laid out what looked like lengths of tubing and a tiny lamp. Then, with a swiftness that startled me despite long acquaintance, he rose and advanced noiselessly. By the time Carter sensed his presence, Holmes had a hand clamped upon the youth's shoulder. "You are industrious, my young friend," Holmes said softly, "but industry in the dark is always suspect." The boy twisted, but Holmes's grip was iron. I hurried forward and struck a match to light our lantern. In its glow, Carter's face emerged, a pale, sharp-featured youth with eyes darting like a trapped animal's. He blurted a denial, insisting he had come only to retrieve tools left behind by the masons. "Tools that require tubing and acid?" Holmes asked dryly. "Come, sir, your story is as thin as your glassware." He gestured toward the packet on the stone. "Explain yourself, or better, explain who sent you." The boy's lips clamped shut, his jaw hardening with defiance. Holmes regarded him a moment, then produced from his pocket the flake of glass we had earlier discovered by the rose. He held it up so that the lantern light caught its edge. "This was yours also, was it not? A careless fragment betrays its maker." Still the boy refused speech. Holmes gave a faint sigh as if disappointed by the lack of imagination, and signaled me to fetch Sir Alister. Within minutes the baronet arrived, robe thrown over his shoulders, his face pale in the lantern glow. At sight of him, Carter's defiance faltered. "Sir," he muttered, "I meant no harm. I was paid, well paid, to set the trick. I swear it was no more than that. Paid?" Holmes repeated. "By whom?" The boy hesitated, glancing between us as if seeking escape. Holmes's voice hardened. "Name your master, or I deliver you to Scotland Yard this very hour. Lestrade will not be as indulgent." The threat sufficed. Carter swallowed. "Mr. Cole, Fabian Cole. He said it was all in jest, a spectacle to impress your cousin Reginald. I never thought it would come to more." Holmes's eyes glittered. "A jest, and yet you return at midnight to tend the apparatus." "No, my lad. You were sent to ensure it remained convincing, perhaps to prepare a further demonstration. Mr. Cole does not jest. He orchestrates." Sir Alister's expression hardened as he looked upon the boy. "Where's Cole now?" he demanded. "I don't know," Carter stammered. "He left me money at a tavern in Holborn, told me to keep the rose alive until he sent word. That is all." Holmes released his shoulder. "So we have a secretary vanished, a cousin silent, and a boy who serves as their instrument. Enough for tonight. Watson, take the apparatus. We shall examine it more closely at Baker Street. Sir Alistair, I suggest you keep your household close until I have traced Cole. He is the hinge upon which this deception turns. We escorted Carter to the gate, where Holmes dismissed him with a warning that Scotland Yard's patience was not inexhaustible. The boy fled into the fog, his footsteps fading quickly. Sir Alistair lingered, troubled. "Mr. Holmes, if my cousin is involved—" Holmes cut him off gently. "Suspicion is not proof. Let us gather the facts. Tomorrow we shall pay a call upon the Briarwood Club in Sussex. If Reginald has indeed withdrawn there, we may learn whether he plays author or victim in this drama." The following morning found us on the train, the frost-silvered fields slipping past the windows. Holmes sat silent, fingers pressed together, his eyes distant. I knew better than to interrupt his reflections, but at last he spoke. "Consider, Watson. Cole acquires apparatus in his own name, employs a youth to set the trick, and then vanishes. Why vanish if all were innocent? Because he expects discovery. But discovery of what? Not merely a conjuring trick, too slight. No, there is a deeper design, and I suspect Reginald Darnington stands at its heart." When we reached Sussex, the Briarwood Club loomed amidst quiet grounds, a respectable retreat of the country gentry. Within, however, we found only bafflement. Reginald had indeed been seen there, but not for nearly a week. He had left abruptly, saying he was summoned to London. No one had heard from him since. Holmes received the news with a slight inclination of the head, as if it confirmed his private expectation. Vanished to London at the same time Cole disappears from Bloomsbury. The two movements are not coincidence. Watson, the circle narrows. Before we are done, I believe we shall find that the rose blooming from stone is but the outer petal of a plot rooted far deeper. Holmes and I returned to London on the evening train, the countryside fading into darkness as lamps flared across the passing villages. Holmes had been silent for much of the journey, his gaze fixed upon nothing, though his mind, I knew, was sifting through every word we had gathered from Carter, from Miss Vale, and from the gentleman at the Briarwood Club. At last he leaned toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Watson, the key to this affair lies not in the rose itself, but in the choice of deception. Why a rose and why from stone? Such symbolism is not chosen idly. There is a message hidden in the contrivance, and messages are sent to someone, not to everyone." I reminded him of Lady Eleanor's fear of omens. Perhaps the flower was intended to prey upon her sensibilities. Holmes shook his head. Lady Eleanor's anxieties are convenient, but not central. This play was staged for Sir Alistair. Consider, he returns from abroad to find his estate altered, his cousin absent, his secretary gone, and a marvel in his garden that defies reason. The effect is to unsettle him, weaken his judgment, make him pliable. What might a baronet in such a condition be induced to sign, to sell, or to surrender? The thought disturbed me, for Sir Alistair had already appeared a man on edge, keenly aware of the weight of family honor. If he were pressed at the right moment with some forged claim or urgent appeal, he might indeed yield ground he would otherwise defend. Holmes seemed to read my reflection in my silence, for he nodded. "Precisely so. Our task, then, is to determine what advantage Reginald, or Cole, sought." When we arrived back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson informed us that a gentleman had called twice in our absence and left no card. Holmes's brows drew together. "Describe him." "Describe him." She recalled only that he was of middle height, dark hair, with a manner too brisk to be entirely polite. "He said he would return. He seemed anxious, Mr. Holmes, almost angry." Holmes paced the room. "Cole, without question. He circles us now, Watson, like a moth about a flame. He fears exposure, yet cannot resist gauging how close I tread." He had scarcely spoken when a firm knock came at the door. Holmes signaled me to remain where I was, and he himself opened it. Standing there was indeed Fabian Cole. He was younger than I had imagined, perhaps 30, with sharp features and an elegance of dress that leaned toward ostentation. His eyes flicked restlessly about the room as he entered, bowing with a show of courtesy that did not reach his lips. "Mr. Holmes." he began smoothly, "I believe you have concerned yourself with certain trifles at Darnington House, matters of flowers and stones. I thought it best to relieve you of wasted effort." Holmes regarded him as one might a wasp intruding upon the breakfast table. "On the contrary, Mr. Cole, my effort has been amply rewarded. We have traced your purchases, spoken to your agent Carter, and examined your handiwork in the garden. You might say the flower is in full bloom." Cole's face tightened, though he attempted a laugh. "A youthful experiment, nothing more. The boy was overzealous. I had no wish to distress Sir Alistair." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Then why vanish? Why instruct Carter in secrecy? Why appear at my rooms tonight, unless you fear the truth will emerge? You have contrived a deception, sir, and I intend to know its purpose." For a moment I thought Cole would bolt. His hand twitched toward the door, then relaxed. He gave a short, bitter smile. "Purpose? Perhaps to remind Sir Alistair that not all stones are firm, and not all roses grow where they should. A symbol, nothing more. If you wish for more than that, ask his cousin." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out, ignoring Holmes's command to stop. By the time I reached the stair, he had already vanished into the night. Holmes closed the door with deliberate calm. "Note it well, Watson, he points us directly to Reginald. Not with the innocence of a servant betrayed, but with the arrogance of one who believes his master untouchable. We must find Reginald without delay. The following morning, Holmes's network of informants, those street urchins whom he dignified as the Baker Street irregulars, were dispatched with descriptions of both Cole and Reginald. While they scoured London's streets, we sought another path. Holmes had me accompany him to the offices of a solicitor known to handle the Darnington affairs. There we learned something that threw sudden light upon the darkness. Reginald Darnington had, only a month past, approached the solicitor with inquiries about the disposition of the estate should Sir Alistair die unmarried. He had asked particularly about the speed with which titles and properties would pass. Such interest, though not illegal, had struck the solicitor as indelicate, and he had discouraged further talk. Reginald had not returned. Holmes's eyes glittered as we emerged into the gray daylight. "There, Watson. The cousin waits upon inheritance. Impatience breeds devices. Suppose he cannot wait for nature to run its course. What then? He contrives to shake Sir Alistair, to bring him to an early grave by fear, or at least to weaken his judgment so that documents may be signed in haste. The rose is a lever, and Cole the arm that wields it." Our return to Baker Street brought fresh news from the irregulars. Cole had been seen in company with Reginald near the docks 2 nights prior, entering a warehouse by the river. The pair had remained within for some time and departed separately. Holmes wasted no moment. "That warehouse will hold our answer, Watson. Tonight we pay it a visit. The rose from stone is but a curtain. Behind it lies the true stage upon which these men perform." I confess my heart quickened at the prospect, for in Holmes's tone there was the unmistakable certainty that the case had reached its hinge. And though the fog of London pressed heavy upon the streets, I felt that we were at last drawing near the truth, though what shape that truth would take I scarcely dared imagine. That evening the fog thickened once again, rolling from the river with a clammy persistence that clung to every lamp and rail. Holmes seemed invigorated by the very gloom that oppressed me. He had secured the address of the warehouse from one of his urchins, and by 9:30 we were making our way through the narrow streets that led toward the docks. The air smelled of tar and brine, punctuated by the occasional cry of a night watchman or the rattle of chains upon a moored vessel. Holmes moved quickly but with a caution born of long practice. This, Watson, is the sort of ground where schemes gather flesh. A baronet's drawing-room might provide the stage dressing, but it is in such places as this that the machinery of deceit turns its wheels. The warehouse loomed ahead, a squat building with shuttered windows and a single door facing the wharf. Its timbers were blackened by years of smoke and salt. A dim glow leaked from a crack where the door met the frame. Holmes signaled for silence and crept forward, his figure blending into shadow until he might have been a piece of the night itself. I followed, less silent than I wished, but he turned and gave a brief nod that reassured me I had not betrayed our presence. At the door, Holmes knelt, producing a slender instrument from his pocket. With deft manipulation, he eased back the latch and the door yielded without protest. Inside, the air was close, heavy with the mingled odor of chemicals and damp wood. We found ourselves among stacked crates and barrels, the floor scattered with straw. Holmes raised a hand, pointing toward the far end where a circle of lamplight revealed two figures bent over a table. I recognized Fabian Cole at once, his sharp profile and restless energy unmistakable. Beside him stood Reginald Darnington, tall and fashionably dressed, though with an air of agitation that betrayed his nerves. Spread before them upon the table were papers and what appeared to be instruments of the same kind we had unearthed beneath the rose. Tubing, flasks, and a small brazier glowing faintly. Holmes's whisper brushed my ear. "We have them." We edged closer until fragments of their conversation carried to us. Reginald was speaking in hurried tones. "It cannot be delayed, Cole. Alistair grows suspicious. If he calls in more advice, the matter is undone. The will must be signed while he remains unsettled." Cole's reply was cool, almost mocking. "And yet you waver. You wanted him unnerved, and I have given you a miracle in his garden. Another few nights of roses, and he will believe the ground itself betrays him. Then he will sign whatever paper you put before him, whether it be for the estate or for his removal to some institution." Reginald struck the table with his palm. "Enough of your insolence. You are paid to serve me, not to gloat." Holmes's hand touched my sleeve. "Do you hear, Watson? Here lies the heart of it. They sought not merely inheritance, but control through coercion." His voice was a threat of breath. "We must seize the moment." But before we could move, the creak of the door announced another arrival. A man in laborer's garb entered, carrying a sack from which protruded the thorned stems of several cut roses. He placed it on the table. "From the hothouse, as you asked. They'll last the night, though they've little fragrance." Cole examined them with satisfaction. "Sufficient for our purpose. A touch of dust, a clever seam, and Sir Alistair will find a dozen blossoms springing from stone by morning." Holmes's eyes gleamed. He stepped forward into the light, his figure suddenly commanding in its upright bearing. "An ingenious performance, gentlemen? But the curtain falls tonight." The effect was electric. Reginald recoiled as though struck, while Cole's hand darted toward the brazier, seizing a length of iron as if to use it as a weapon. Before he could raise it, Holmes closed the distance, his grip fastening upon the man's wrist with startling strength. The iron clattered to the floor. I rushed forward and secured Reginald, who offered little resistance beyond trembling protest. Cole, struggling in Holmes's grasp, spat out words through clenched teeth. "You meddle where you are not wanted, Holmes. This is family business." Holmes's voice was like steel. "When family business employs deception, fraud, and coercion, it becomes the business of the law. You and your patron here have sown dust and roses to unseat a man from his reason. You shall answer for it. We bound them with rope found among the crates." Reginald muttered incoherently, veering between pleas for leniency and bitter accusations against Cole. Cole maintained a defiant silence, his eyes glittering with hatred. Holmes regarded them both with cold detachment. "Watson, we must summon Lestrade. He will grumble at being called from his bed, but the Yard will be eager to exhibit such a neat capture." Leaving me to guard the prisoners, Holmes stepped out into the night to fetch assistance. The minutes lengthened, filled only with the distant lap of water against the wharf. Reginald sat hunched, his face buried in his hands. Cole, however, never ceased watching me, his gaze sharp as a knife. When at last Holmes returned with Lestrade and 2 constables, the scene was swiftly resolved. The prisoners were marched out, cursing or sobbing by turns. Lestrade, though outwardly irritable at being summoned, could not wholly conceal his admiration. "You've saved us a deal of trouble, Mr. Holmes. We'd never have dreamt a baronet's cousin would stoop to such trickery." Holmes's reply was characteristically dry. "You would have dreamt it, Lestrade, had you examined the dust upon a rose petal." As we followed the police out into the fog, Holmes's stride was brisk, but I sensed the case had not yet reached its conclusion in his mind. His silence as we returned to Baker Street was not the silence of satisfaction. but of a man turning some final piece into place, awaiting the moment when the whole picture would stand revealed. Holmes's mood on the morning following the arrests was one of quiet intensity rather than triumph. He spent the early hours pacing the sitting room, stopping occasionally to draw from his pipe and scatter long trails of smoke against the ceiling. I ventured a remark upon the success of the venture at the warehouse, but he waved it aside with a brusqueness that told me the matter was not yet concluded in his estimation. "Do you imagine, Watson," he said at last, "that a mind as calculating as Fabian Cole's would entrust the entire scheme to one crude contrivance and a few midnight visits to a garden? No, such men weave layers. The outer thread is cut, but the inner web may yet ensnare Sir Alistair if we do not tear it out entire." I admitted my unease. Cole's defiance, even under arrest, had been remarkable. He had not pleaded nor despaired, but carried himself as though the game were far from lost. Holmes seized upon the thought at once. Just so, a man confident of his hold upon documents, or secrets, or accomplices. He halted, his gaze suddenly sharp. "We must see Sir Alistair at once. He may already be in danger of the very papers Reginald spoke of." By mid-morning, we were once more at Darnington House. Sir Alistair received us in his library, visibly relieved to learn of his cousin's arrest, yet still harried by uncertainty. Lady Eleanor hovered anxiously near, while Miss Vale maintained her usual composure with the ledger at her side. Holmes wasted no time. "Sir Alistair, I must ask, have you signed any papers presented by either your cousin or by Mr. Cole in recent weeks? Deeds, contracts, transfers, even letters that seemed routine?" The baronet frowned, thinking. "There were some papers. Cole brought them, saying they were to settle accounts relating to the works on the garden. I confess I signed quickly, eager to be rid of his chatter. You think them dangerous?" Holmes requested the papers, and Miss Vale fetched a sheaf neatly tied with twine. He spread them across the desk, his eyes moving swiftly from line to line. Presently he tapped one sheet with his forefinger. "Here it is, a cleverly drawn document transferring control of certain investments to Reginald, under guise of settlement for the Masons. The sum is modest on the surface, but the wording grants wide authority. With this in his hand, your cousin could have drained much of your income before the fraud was uncovered." Sir Alistair blanched. "Then I have been made a fool." Holmes's tone softened. "Not a fool, sir, but a target. Their contrivance was intended to confuse and unsettle, and under such conditions many would sign without scrutiny. The marvel of a rose from stone was but a stage effect to distract your eye while the true theft was accomplished with pen and ink." Miss Vale, whose composure had never faltered, leaned forward with sudden urgency. "Then you must revoke it at once, Sir Alistair. We must notify the solicitor before any claim can be made upon your accounts." Holmes gave her a long, searching look before nodding. "Just so, and it must be done today." Arrangements were made at once, and by afternoon the solicitor had confirmed that the papers would be rendered void. Sir Alistair's relief was palpable, though Holmes's countenance remained pensive. As we prepared to leave, he lingered by the tray upon which the faint residue of dust still lay from the first day of our visit. He touched it lightly, then rubbed his fingers together as though testing its quality. "There is still one question, Watson," he said as we stepped into the chill air of the street. "Cole's purpose is plain, to secure wealth for himself and Reginald. But there remains the matter of his arrogance." He faced us with the air of one who believed his hand stronger still. What did he conceal? What further lever might he hold? That evening Lestrade called at Baker Street with his report. Cole and Reginald were held at Newgate, but the younger man remained insolent. "He laughs at us, Holmes," Lestrade growled. "Says we have only the petals while he holds the root. Blast his impudence, he near convinced half the men that he'd be out before the week is done." Holmes heard this without surprise. "You see, Watson, he boasts of the root. The rose from stone was never the heart of his scheme. It was the flourish. The root lies elsewhere, and if we fail to uncover it, Sir Alistair will yet find his estate imperiled." He rose suddenly, took his hat, and beckoned me. "Come, we must visit Newgate. I would hear Cole's boasts from his own lips." The prison was grim in the yellow lamplight, its iron gates and echoing corridors chill even in the presence of warders. Cole awaited us in his cell, reclining upon the narrow bench with the composure of a man in a drawing-room. He greeted Holmes with mock civility. "Ah, the gardener of truths comes to prune again. But beware, Mr. Holmes. Roses grow back and thorns prick even the careful hand." Holmes regarded him with cool detachment. "You speak as one confident still. Yet your contrivances are exposed, your accomplice disgraced. What root remains that you cling to?" Cole's smile deepened. "You will see. Ask Sir Alistair about his sister. Ask Lady Eleanor what she whispers in the dark. The rose was never for him alone." Holmes's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. As we departed, I could not help but voice my frustration. "Surely he seeks only to unsettle us, Holmes, to throw suspicion where none belongs." Holmes shook his head. "Perhaps. But I have long learned that even in the villain's taunt lies a seed of truth. We must examine Lady Eleanor's position more closely. Tonight we have cut the stem, Watson. But until we know whether the root spreads through the family itself, the flower may bloom anew." And with that I knew the case, far from concluded, was entering a more perilous phase than any contraption of glass and stone. Holmes walked swiftly upon our return from Newgate, his cloak snapping in the night air, his stride lengthening as if each step drove him closer to some unspoken certainty. I could scarcely keep pace, yet I knew better than to interrupt the long silence in which his thoughts arranged themselves. When at last we reached Baker Street and Mrs. Hudson had brought the lamp, he cast himself into the armchair with abrupt finality, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Watson," he said, "Cole's words must not be dismissed as idle spite. He is too deliberate, too skilled at thrusting the blade where it wounds." He spoke of Lady Eleanor. "We must learn whether she is victim, accomplice, or pawn," I protested gently. Lady Eleanor's fragility, her trembling hands and anxious gaze, had seemed to me wholly genuine. Surely she cannot be part of this sordid design. "Appearances deceive," Holmes replied curtly. "A delicate woman may still possess resolve enough to steer others. Or she may be the lever by which others move, Sir Alistair. In either case, she lies at the center of Cole's last boast." The following morning we returned to Darnington House. Sir Alistair received us with relief, his manner less strained now that the fraudulent papers had been revoked. Lady Eleanor, however, seemed paler than before, and I thought I detected in her expression not merely anxiety but an undercurrent of guilt. She greeted us with politeness, yet her eyes sought her brother's face with a searching quality, as though weighing his temper. Miss Vale sat nearby, attentive but silent. Holmes engaged Lady Eleanor at once, though with a gentleness unusual in him. "Madam, I must trouble you with a delicate question. Has Fabian Cole ever spoken to you privately, or sought to persuade you on matters concerning your brother's estate?" Her hands trembled slightly upon the lace of her gown. For a moment she did not answer. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, she admitted, "Mr. Cole was courteous to me. He suggested that my brother's long absence abroad had weakened his claim in the eyes of society. He spoke of securing my position, of ensuring I would never be left dependent." She faltered, her cheeks coloring faintly. "He pressed me to encourage Alistair to settle more of the estate in my favor, for safety," he said. "But I never urged it. I told him such matters belonged only to my brother." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And yet, Lady Eleanor, might he have persuaded you to sign anything, perhaps a harmless-seeming note or acknowledgment?" Her breath caught. Slowly, she drew from a small escritoire a folded paper. "He placed this before me a fortnight past. He said it was merely a letter of confidence, a declaration that I trusted him to manage certain household accounts." I signed, thinking it inconsequential. Holmes examined the document. His lips tightened. Not a letter, Watson, but a cleverly drafted assignment, an instrument by which Cole could claim to act as Lady Eleanor's agent in financial matters. Combined with the papers Sir Alistair unwittingly signed, it would have placed the estate in their hands entirely. Sir Alistair's face flushed with anger and shame. "That villain dared to prey upon my sister's innocence? He shall pay dearly for it." Holmes laid the paper flat upon the desk. And yet the matter is graver still. Note here the clause naming a third party. It does not bind only to Cole but to successors and assigns. Reginald was to be the true inheritor of this scheme. Cole's arrogance derives from his knowledge that even with him imprisoned, the net remains cast. Miss Vale, who had remained silent until now, spoke with sudden firmness. Then the sooner the document is destroyed, the better. Holmes regarded her with an unreadable expression. Destroyed, yes, but not before we use it. Cole boasts of the root. Let us see if we can draw the root into the light by making him believe it still thrives. For that, Lady Eleanor, you must play a part. Are you willing? She looked frightened, yet nodded. If it will free my brother from this torment, I shall do as you advise. Holmes's plan was characteristically bold. He dictated a letter in Lady Eleanor's hand, addressed to Cole, stating that she had reconsidered and was prepared to place further trust in him, provided he sent instructions through an intermediary. The note was entrusted to one of Holmes's agents, with orders to deliver it in such a way that it must. Holmes's words weighed heavily upon me as we returned from Newgate, the damp London streets echoing with the clip of our boots. Lady Eleanor, delicate and withdrawn as she appeared, seemed the least likely figure to play any role in her cousin's scheme. Yet Holmes's instincts, sharpened by years of practice, did not alight upon shadows without reason. He spent the night in restless silence, alternately pacing and collapsing into his chair, the smoke of his pipe wreathing him in a haze more impenetrable than the fog outside. I confess that sleep claimed me before clarity did him. By morning he had resolved upon action. Watson, we must see Lady Eleanor at once and without her brother present. Truth concealed often slips most readily in private conversation, when the weight of family dignity is not there to press it down. Sir Alister, though initially reluctant, granted us the liberty. Lady Eleanor received us in her chamber, a dim and perfumed room with the curtains drawn against the gray morning. She lay upon a chaise, pale and fragile, her hands clasped about a book of prayers. Her eyes, when they met ours, flickered with apprehension. Holmes seated himself lightly upon a chair opposite her. His voice softened from its usual sharpness. "Lady Eleanor, I must trouble you with candor. Your brother is the object of a conspiracy. We have secured those chiefly responsible, yet one of them, before his arrest, hinted that the root of the matter lay within these very walls. He spoke of you." The color fled from her cheeks, leaving her ashen. "Of me, that is impossible. I have never conspired against Alister, never." Holmes inclined his head. "I do not accuse. I seek clarity. Tell me, who has been closest to you during these last months? To whom have you confided your thoughts?" Her gaze fell to her lap. "Miss Vale. She is my friend as well as my companion. It is she who manages the household accounts, who comforts me when my strength fails. I have told her things I would not trouble Alister with." Holmes's eyes sharpened, though his tone remained even. "And has she ever spoken of your cousin Reginald?" "Yes," Lady Eleanor whispered. "She said he was ambitious, that he believed Alister weak. She warned me that changes were coming, that I must prepare myself. I thought she sought only to guard me, but—" She hesitated, tears welling. Once I woke to hear her speaking softly in the corridor. I believed she said Reginald's name, though when I asked, she laughed it away. Holmes rose, and for an instant I glimpsed the fierce light in his eyes, the certainty forming. He turned to Lady Eleanor with grave courtesy. "You have aided us more than you know. You have been an innocent instrument, and Miss Vale has plucked the strings. I ask you to remain calm and to trust me for what must come." We left her in trembling silence, and Holmes drew me swiftly into the hall. Watson, the companion, is the hand behind the veil. Cole and Reginald supplied the contrivance, but Miss Vale supplied the access, the accounts, the whispered poison. She has woven herself into Lady Eleanor's trust, and through her sought to undermine Alister's stability. While the men labored in shadows, she tilled the soil in daylight. I struggled to reconcile this with the brisk, competent woman I had seen so often, yet the logic was undeniable. Holmes requested Sir Alister summon Miss Vale at once. She entered the library with her usual composure, ledger in hand, her expression calm. "Miss Vale," Holmes began without preamble, "we have discovered your associate's fraud. Cole and Reginald are in custody, yet their scheme required a gardener within the household, one who could shape accounts, whisper doubts, and ensure Sir Alister's authority eroded under seeming order. That gardener was you." For the first time her poise cracked. A flush rose to her cheeks. "That is absurd. I am but a servant, employed to keep figures in line. I have done nothing but my duty." Holmes's voice hardened. "Your duty did not include paying Purkis and Sons for chemical apparatus under false pretense, nor counseling Lady Eleanor that her brother's reason might be failing. Those were your contributions to the plot. When Cole is pressed further, he will confirm it. Confess now, and you may yet temper your fate." Her silence lengthened, her jaw taut. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound without mirth. "And what would I confess to? That I tired of keeping accounts for a household that held me in contempt? That Reginald promised me place and comfort when Alister was unseated? Yes, I dealt with Cole. Yes, I signed for goods. And yes, I told Eleanor what would shake her. Do you think it difficult to persuade a woman already weakened that she hears whispers in the dark?" Sir Alister, who had stood aghast, recoiled as if struck. "Vale, you, whom my sister trusted above all?" Her eyes blazed. "Trust is a coin easily spent when one has nothing else. You never looked at me save as a tool. Reginald at least offered me a future. Call it betrayal if you like. I call it survival." Holmes signaled Lestrade, who had been summoned discreetly to stand ready. The inspector and his men entered, and Miss Vale's composure finally crumbled as she was taken into custody, her defiance collapsing into bitter silence. When she had gone, Sir Alister sank heavily into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "My own household turned against me. My cousin, my secretary, my sister's companion. What remains that is not corrupted?" Holmes laid a hand upon his shoulder, rare in its gentleness. "Your honor remains, Sir Alister, and your sister's affection, though shaken, will endure. Treachery corrodes, but it cannot destroy what is founded upon truth. The plot is uprooted, and with it the rose that never should have grown." That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, I reflected aloud on the cruelty of such schemes, and Holmes, gazing out at the darkened streets, gave one of his rare philosophical replies. "Men devise illusions, Watson. Roses blooming from stone, miracles from dust, to bend others to their will. But in the end, no deception can withstand the clear light of reason. Our task is not to marvel at the bloom, but to trace the root." And in that quiet, I understood that the strange flower in Sir Alister's garden had been nothing more than the emblem of a deeper corruption, now torn up by its roots through Holmes's inexorable logic. The days following Miss Vale's arrest were heavy with a kind of subdued relief at Darnington House. Sir Alister, though visibly shaken, resumed his duties with the air of a man determined to reclaim dignity after humiliation. Lady Eleanor, pale but steadier, clung to her brother with a tenderness I had not seen before, as though the near betrayal of her companion had bound her more closely to him. For Holmes, however, the business was not yet concluded. His restlessness betrayed him, and his violin sang late into the night in our rooms at Baker Street, alternately mournful and piercing, as though his bow searched for a note still unresolved. It was during one such evening that Lestrade arrived, his expression a mixture of triumph and perplexity. "We've secured all three, Holmes, Cole, Reginald, and the woman. Their accounts match in part, but each strives to blame the other. Vale admits to misleading Lady Eleanor and shifting funds. Cole admits the contrivance of the rose, though he calls it no more than a parlor trick. And Reginald insists he was merely led astray by clever tongues. But here's the difficulty. The Crown may find it hard to prove conspiracy to defraud when each denies intent. Without stronger evidence, their punishments may be lighter than their villainy deserves." Holmes, who had been leaning against the mantel, tapped the stem of his pipe against his palm. "Just so, Lestrade. The law prefers documents to deductions, signatures to suspicions. But we have not yet laid bare the entire scheme. Tell me, did Cole surrender the keys to the warehouse by the docks? Lestrade confirmed he had, though he professed no interest in what remained there beyond the chemical remnants already catalogued. Holmes's eyes flashed. Then he has hidden nothing further, or so he believes. That is where we may yet find what the law requires. The next morning saw us once more by the Thames, the fog rising in pale coils from the water. The warehouse stood silent, its door barred now under the yard's seal. Lestrade, somewhat grudgingly, allowed Holmes the liberty of an inspection, provided I bore witness. Inside, the place seemed barren. Crates stood open and empty, straw scattered where once it had cushioned glass. Yet Holmes prowled with the keen patience of a hound, pausing to sniff the air, to scrape his finger along a beam, to listen to the hollow echo beneath the boards. At length he stopped, crouched near the corner where damp stained the timbers. With his knife he prized up a section of flooring, and there, within a narrow cavity, lay a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes opened them with a precision that belied his apparent detachment. The contents were damning. Drafts of letters in Reginald's hand, instructing Cole to secure funds, notes from Vale on the progress of unsettling Lady Eleanor, and, most decisive, a contract already drawn, though unsigned, transferring a substantial portion of Sir Alister's estate to an anonymous trustee. The trustee's name left blank. Ready for insertion, Lestrade gave a low whistle. "This will do, Holmes. No jury will doubt their purpose now." Holmes replaced the papers carefully, then stood with a small smile that was more satisfaction than triumph. You see, Watson, the rose from stone was no more than the flourish of a conjurer's hand. The true weapon lay in these dry papers, ink on parchment, that would have stripped a man of fortune and reputation without his even grasping the loss until too late. Cole boasted of roots. Well, here they are, entwined and poisonous. That evening, back at Baker Street, Sir Alister called upon us. The ordeal had left its mark, but he bore himself with more steadiness than I had yet seen. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I owe you not only gratitude, but my very estate. Without your intervention I should have been ruined, and my sister left in despair. No words of mine can suffice." Holmes inclined his head slightly, though his manner remained cool. "You owe me nothing, Sir Alister, save perhaps a willingness to look more closely at the papers you sign. Human credulity is the soil in which deception flourishes. Guard that soil well." Lady Eleanor had written separately, a letter Holmes read in silence and then placed gently into the fire. When I asked why, he said only, "Some words are meant to comfort, Watson, and comfort does not require preservation." With the arrests confirmed and the evidence secured, the case at last found its conclusion in the courts. Cole, Reginald, and Miss Vale were tried together. The documents, Holmes discovered, sealed their fate, and though each attempted to shift blame, the unity of their purpose was made plain. Sentences were passed that reflected not only their fraud, but the cruelty with which they had sought to unseat a man by undermining his sanity. 1 week later, Holmes and I walked once more through the garden at Darnington House. The false rose had been uprooted, its stone disc removed, leaving only bare earth and a faint circle of disturbed soil. Montague, the gardener, greeted us with gruff satisfaction. "It'll be turned to honest roses now, gentlemen. No tricks in my beds again, not while I live." Holmes paused, gazing at the empty space. His expression, for a fleeting moment, softened. "There is irony here, Watson. A rose forced from stone by artifice has perished, but from this soil, honest and patient, true roses will bloom. Deception can never long endure where truth is given room." As we left the house and the winter fog curled once more round the lamplights, I reflected upon the strange path the case had taken, from a miracle flower to a conspiracy of fraud, from whispered omens to hidden contracts. Holmes, reading my thoughts as ever, gave a brief, sardonic smile. "You see, my dear fellow, there is no miracle. Only men, their greed, and their ingenuity. And it is our task to strip away the petals until nothing remains but the stem." And so ended the curious affair of the rose that grew from stone, an emblem of deceit that, under Holmes's relentless logic, had withered before it could wound those who had been its intended victims. Holmes had little inclination for celebration once the trial was concluded, though London society, ever eager for sensation, spoke of little else for a fortnight. The Times praised the miraculous detection of fraud within a noble family, and the Illustrated London News could not resist printing an engraving of the infamous rose rising from its stone disk. Holmes read neither. He dismissed such accounts with a curl of his lip. They prefer the flourish, Watson, to the root. They marvel at the rose, but they care not how it was fed. Sir Alister, relieved of his cousin's designs and the treachery of those closest to him, began at last to steady himself. He wrote to Holmes with a dignity that seemed restored, promising greater vigilance over both his affairs and the company he kept. Lady Eleanor, recovering from the bitter sting of betrayal, sought peace in quiet charity, her health improving once the shadows of deceit were lifted. Of Miss Vale, Cole, and Reginald little more need be said. The law had claimed them, and their names, once whispered in drawing-rooms, faded swiftly into the obscurity of those whose ambitions had overreached. One evening, as the fog curled once more along Baker Street and the fire glowed warmly in our grate, I remarked upon the curious blend of contrivance and cruelty the case had revealed. To imagine, Holmes, that an honest man might be driven to despair by a flower where none should grow, it chills me. They might as well have placed a dagger in his breast. Holmes leaned back, his pipe sending thin blue spirals into the lamplight. A dagger, Watson, strikes swiftly and leaves no doubt of its nature. Far more dangerous is the deception that creeps quietly, making a man question his reason, doubt his own senses, and surrender of his own will what no force could wrest from him. That is why I value clarity above all else, for clarity is the one weapon deception cannot withstand. I reflected that had Holmes not intervened, Sir Alister might even now be regarded as unfit, his estate dissolved beneath the signatures of men who pretended to serve him. Holmes gave a slight nod. So you see why Cole smiled even in his cell. He fancied himself an artist of illusions, crafting not merely a flower, but a world in which men disbelieved their eyes and yielded their fortunes. But every artist leaves brushstrokes, Watson, and every fraud leaves residue. Dust upon a petal, an entry in an account, a whisper overheard in the night. One has but to see them. There was silence for a time, broken only by the faint bustle of the street below and the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Then Holmes, with that sudden change of mood which so often overtook him when a case was concluded, reached for his violin. As the bow drew its first note, mournful yet strangely resolute, he cast me a sidelong glance. "It is done, my friend. Another web cut, another illusion dispelled. Let us be content with that, for the world is rich in deceivers, and they will provide us labor enough." And so the affair of the rose that grew from stone was laid to rest, not as a miracle, nor as a mystery, but as one more triumph of Holmes's relentless reason. For myself, I could never again look upon a rose without recalling that strange night in Bloomsbury when a flower bloomed upon marble, and how, beneath its pale beauty, lay nothing but dust, deceit, and the steady hand of Sherlock Holmes to strip them bare.